In Summation, a poem by Taylor Swift. I'm bringing you another midweek video today. You may have noticed that in these videos I'm tending not to talk about specific Taylor Swift songs, so that may be the pattern going forward, but I do reiterate that you can't expect one of these every week. That's certainly not going to happen. It's just when something springs to my mind that I think would be interesting to talk about, to address. Now, In Summation is a poem that Taylor Swift wrote that accompanies the physical copies of her album, The Tortured Poets Department. It's a kind of prologue which provides some context for the songs of the album. It doesn't reveal to the reader or the listener what specific relationships he's addressing in any particular song. It doesn't mention anyone by name, in other words. So if you're unfamiliar with her dating history, this won't really help you at all in terms of identifying who she's talking about. But what it does do is make it quite clear that on this album, the original album, she's talking about two distinct relationships, one of which is a long, steady, stable, safe relationship, and the other of which is a chaotic, brief, fiery relationship. And each of the songs is usually dealing with one of those situations rather than the other. So I reiterate here that you can understand these songs without knowing the name of the particular individual that she's referring to, as long as you can recognize from within the song itself, I guess, that this is a long-term relationship or this is a short-term relationship. Of course, I will again admit that those little details that she puts in that indicate a specific person, some specific characteristic of a person, are really interesting and really intriguing if you want to dig into that. But you can understand what the song is about if you understand those two categories. I went back just over the last couple of weeks and watched some of the initial reactions to this album on the night that it was released. And it's fascinating watching people struggle with these songs, trying to figure out who or what this particular song is about. And the reason for that is that people expected this to be an album about her relationship with Joe Alwyn, which was a 6-year relationship. And it's fascinating watching them struggle to try to fit into that framework a song which is actually talking about a very brief and very fiery relationship. And they really have to contort themselves to try and fit it into that framework. That, I think, in itself is an interesting illustration of how when we approach a song, a movie, a piece of literature, we approach that with our own framework, with our own set of assumptions, and that will shape how we interpret that song or that piece of writing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's a real stretch to try to fit some of the songs on the Tortured Poets Department into this idea of a 6-year-long, fairly stable, safe-seeming relationship. It just doesn't work. Occasionally in those videos, there's a moment of enlightenment when people suddenly realize this is referring to Matty Healy. It's not referring to Joe Alwyn. But I say again, you don't actually have to know the names of those people. You don't have to know the specifics of that relationship. The really important thing for the album and what this particular poem provides the context for is understanding that there's a short-term fiery relationship and a long-term stable relationship. So I want to go into this poem and see what I can glean from it. There are contained within it very specific references to certain songs on the album. Sometimes I'll know what that song is, sometimes I won't. I'll know it's from one of the songs, but I may not be able to identify immediately what song it's from. But I don't want to make this even more laborious than it's probably going to be by having to go through and search through all the lyrics and specify which song this is actually referring to. It's enough to know that it's in one of the songs on the album. Sometimes, though, I will know and I will point that out. So this poem is called In Summation. It's presented with the physical copies of the album, and it offers a kind of prologue or introduction to the album. So let's dive into it. In Summation. At this hearing, I'll stop immediately here because at this hearing immediately brings to mind the song How Did It End, which is kind of set up as a hearing, a kind of coroner's inquest into the death of a particular relationship. So here she's echoing that imagery. This is a hearing. At this hearing, I stand before my fellow members of the Tortured Poets Department. Who is that? Well, perhaps it's other artists. Perhaps it's you and me. Perhaps it's her audience at this point. I stand before you, my fellow members of the Tortured Poets Department, with a summary of my findings. A debrief, a detailed rewinding. There's quite a strong rhyming pattern through this first verse. I don't think she's following any specific rhyming pattern throughout the poem, or indeed any kind of specific rhythm or meter throughout this poem. If you think she is, then please let me know. I'm not a poetry expert. So with a summary of my findings, a debrief, a detailed rewinding. So she's winding back the tape, going back to the beginning of the video, going back to the beginning of the story, and summarizing what's taken place in this story, which is essentially the story of her relationships, her last two relationships, maybe even going further back than that, for the purpose of warning, for the sake of reminding. So, warning and reminding. It's a cautionary tale. The album is presented here as a cautionary tale, but it's also a reminder. Memory, remembrance is an extremely important theme in Taylor Swift's writing, as it has been in the writing of the Romantic poets. I did a whole video on that. I'll leave a link to that below. So she's presenting this anthology of poetry, these songs to us as a warning, but also as a reminder. Let's recall, let's remember what's taken place. So there's an element of lest we forget, never again. We need to remember these things in order to avoid them in the future. We need to remember these things because they have helped to shape us. And by remembering them, we understand ourselves better. As you might all unfortunately recall, this line's a little bit clunky. I think it probably just needed, as you might all recall. I think that would have worked better. I think unfortunately is a little bit clunky. An unnecessary adverb, which I as an editor encountered in writing. I had been struck with a case of restricted humanity. We'll come back to that idea of being restricted later. She builds on that image later, which explains my plea here today of temporary insanity. In the original handwritten version on the album, this is spaced out to emphasize the word insanity. You see, the pendulum swings, oh the chaos it brings. Chaos pervades the poems, the songs on this album. Leads the caged beast to do the most curious things. So here is this idea of restricted humanity. She has perceived herself in one of these relationships as a caged beast. This image of the cage recurs again and again in Taylor's writing and in her music videos as well. She's the bird in the gilded cage. That's essentially the image that she's presenting with us here. But not just a bird, a beast, and we get that in Who's Afraid of Little Old Me. She's been a caged beast. And now that she's free, basically she's gone wild. And she says, to do the most curious things. This is kind of a quaint expression. It leads me back to Alice in Wonderland, curiouser and curiouser. It's a kind of quaint term to describe what is really chaos. She's mentioned that there is chaos in the way, but then she uses this really quaint term to do the most curious things. It's an interesting juxtaposition of this chaos and this kind of almost British reserve. I have in my mind the image of some kind of British lord or lady watching a riot out in the streets and saying, most curious. Then we get Lovers spend years denying what's ill-fated. Lovers here. In the original handwritten version, that's written in a kind of curly cursive text, and here it's presented in italics because it's a clear reference back to her Lover album, which is written in that, the title of which is written in that kind of text. So she's casting our minds back to the Lover album, which was largely about her relationship with Joe Alwyn, which was in its early days then, but it was inspiring her in those days. But she's kind of hinting that even back then there were issues. And if you go back and listen to that album in the light of what later happened between her and Joe, you recognize that she's already signaling that there are some red flags here. It wasn't as comfortable as it perhaps seemed. But they spent years denying what's ill-fated. So this relationship she ultimately regarded as ill-fated, but they spent years denying that. So resentment rotting away galaxies we created. So they, in a way, they worked really hard on this relationship, trying to create something wonderful, galaxies. And then she goes on to describe this in more detail. What were the galaxies they created? Stars placed and glued meticulously by hand next to the ceiling fan. It's very important that they're placed meticulously. A lot of care has gone into this relationship. Taylor is the mastermind, and she worked on this relationship by hand. It's a handcrafted relationship. Tried wishing on comets. Comets are often seen as a bad omen in ancient times, portents of that something bad was about to happen. She tried wishing on those. She tried dimming the shine. She tried to hide her light under a bushel, I suppose you could say. In the song Bejeweled from the Midnight's album, she gives us a sense that during that relationship she wasn't allowed to shine. Now that she's out of that relationship, she shows the world that she's still bejeweled. So there's a sense in which she was trying to shape herself to fit into that relationship, to fit into that situation. Tried to orbit his planet, so she tried to make him the center of her existence, the center of her life. Some stars never align. So fate is one of the themes running through this album and indeed through a lot of Taylor Swift's writing. But here, some stars never align. It just wasn't meant to be, no matter how much they tried, no matter how hard they tried. Notice how she plays with this kind of celestial imagery here. Galaxies, stars, comets, shining planets. She makes this metaphor run through this whole series of verses here. Then you have this line which stands all on its own. And in one conversation, I tore down the whole sky. With sky, we're still kind of fitting into that celestial kind of imagery. But for all the years that they spent trying to build this relationship, to buttress this relationship, to save this relationship, all it took was one conversation and the whole thing came tumbling down. She tore down the whole sky. So she's indicating to us here that it was her initiative. And I guess in some ways that you can see some of the warning here. She's warning, first of all, about the fact that some stars never align. No matter how much work you put into something, it's never going to work. But also how easy it is to bring something down, how difficult it is to build something, and how terrifyingly easy it is to tear it all down again. So now she's free again. Spring sprung forth with dazzling freedom hues. Then a crash from the skylight bursting through. Now, I have here in my mind the image of something like a Mission Impossible movie. Tom Cruise dropping from a helicopter, smashing through a skylight. There's that kind of action, adventure, maybe rescue sort of imagery going on here. Then it quietens down a little bit. It becomes a little bit more classical in tone. There's this interesting movement within this poem between kind of flashy, fast-paced, dazzling imagery, which maybe reflects one of the relationships, and this softer, more somber, quieter, more classical sounding language. So something old, something hallowed, who told me he could be brand new. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. She's playing on that here, as she does in a number of her songs. Something old is interesting because there's a sense in which the new relationship that she's going to move into is actually something old, and that becomes clear from some of the songs. It's a rekindling of an earlier relationship, falling back into rekindled flames. There was something, a spark between them at an earlier time. Now she's free, and something old, someone hallowed. This is how it seemed to her at the time. She had built an image of this person, of this potential relationship, and we see this in the songs, how she had built this relationship in her mind, and she had built this person in her mind, which is why its ending is so disappointing. It's such a letdown. So something old, someone hallowed, who told me he could be brand new. So he is promising to her to be the new element in this relationship too. That was one of the promises. Again, promise is something that runs through the songs, I think particularly of the song Peter. There were promises made, and one of the promises he made was that he could be brand new. This would be a new start. Again, this is part of the warning. He promised to be something new. He couldn't live up to the promise. And so I was out of the oven and into the microwave. So this is a play on the old image of out of the frying pan into the fire, leaving one potentially dangerous situation only to find yourself in an even more dangerous situation. And here she's also playing with the kind of pace element of these relationships. An oven is a slow burn, it's a slow process, but a microwave is quick. That's why we have microwaves, to cut down the length of the cooking process. So from the long relationship to the short relationship, out of the slammer and into a tidal wave. Well, Fresh Out of the Slammer is the name of one of the songs on the album. But again, she's moving from a place of imprisonment, restriction, but into a tidal wave. Now, these next two lines are, I think, amongst the best that Taylor has ever written. How gallant to save the Empress from her gilded tower, swinging a sword he could barely lift. What a diss. Is that word still used? I don't know, I'm old. How gallant to save the Empress from her gilded tower. So he presented himself crashing through the skylight as coming to rescue her, his Empress, from her gilded tower. We see a reference to her being locked up in a tower in the Albatross. Swinging a sword he could barely lift. He's the smallest man who ever lived. He can't even lift this sword up. He wasn't up to the task. You see how we've gone into the kind of the medieval kind of old-timey language again here? There's definitely a mixture of that, of the quill style and sometimes the fountain pen style, and not so much the glitter pen style here, although there are some glittery images here too. So maybe the glitter gel pen style as well. But this part here has this very much an old-timey sort of medieval feel to it. But loneliness struck at that fateful hour, low-hanging fruit on his wine-stained lips. Now, some people have interpreted this as implying that Matty Healy was the low-hanging fruit for her, but I see it in a different way. I think she's saying here that she was the low-hanging fruit for him. She was lonely, she was vulnerable. He saw his opportunity, he came in and plucked the low-hanging fruit. And wine-stained here kind of introduces to me images of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and celebration. So we have this kind of celebratory party, out all night kind of image in this other relationship. Another brilliant pair of lines. Actually, each of them's presented as a standalone line. He never even scratched the surface of me. And then none of them did. None of them have really found her. Taylor's always wanting to be seen, to be heard. She expresses that in her songs. It's not a superficial wish, though. She wants someone to really see her. And most of us only see the glittering surface. The person who can do it with a broken heart. We see her glittering image. We see the mirror ball. No one, she says, none of the lovers that she's been with anyway, have really seen into her. Then we return, sort of making it more explicit that we're in a kind of hearing situation here. In summation, it was not a love affair. I screamed while bringing my fists to my coffee-ringed desk. Now I think this should be read not as a separate line, but as a continuation of the first line. In summation, it was not a love affair, I screamed while bringing my fists to my coffee-ringed desk. All right, so there's some anger here. It was not a love affair. It was a mutual manic phase. It was self-harm. This may refer to both relationships because it was house and then cardiac arrest. Another brilliant piece of writing here. The first relationship was house arrest. The second was cardiac arrest. So house arrest again refers to this sense she had of being imprisoned, of having a restricted life. But then cardiac arrest is this wild, chaotic moment, heart-stopping stuff. But it's interesting that she uses the word arrest here too, because that also occurs as a theme in Florida. And in my recollection of listening to the album, I've never really been able to clearly fit the song Florida into the scheme. But perhaps this is where it fits here with this imagery of arrest. Now, almost sonnet-like, we get a shift in the poem here. A smirk creeps onto the poet's face. In a sonnet, at line 12, I think, in a Shakespearean sonnet, there's always a shift in the meaning, a kind of reversal of meaning, usually led with an and yet or a but. That's not here, but the sense of it is still here. A smirk creeps onto this poet's face, because it's the worst men that I write best. So despite the pain that she's been through, the chaos that she's been through, the side of her that is a poet recognizes that this is all going to be material for her songs. And here it is, the Tortured Poets Department. There's almost an element of calculation about this, Taylor being the mastermind again. Because even while she's experiencing all these emotions, the pain, the suffering, the anger, there's this other side of her which glimpses the possibilities. So now we kind of move into the final part of the poem. And so I enter into evidence. And here we're kind of back in that courtroom hearing kind of setting. And there are, in fact, 5 things that she enters into evidence. My tarnished coat of arms. The coat of arms is a symbol of the family, a symbol of their history, a mark of their honour. But she's saying that her coat of arms is tarnished. The family name is tarnished. And again, that theme is evident in the Tortured Poets Department. She can ruin her name if she wants. And note again that we're still in this kind of old-timey, sort of classical language here. So the first piece of evidence is her tarnished coat of arms. Second piece of evidence, my muses acquired like bruises. So in classical Greek mythology, the muses are those who inspire the artist, they inspire the poet, the songwriter. But her muses are acquired like bruises. So even while the smile creeps on her face, she knows that there's material here for her to use as a poet. Nevertheless, this has been acquired at a cost. The tarnishing of her coat of arms and the bruises she bears. The third thing she brings to evidence are my talismans and charms. I kind of think in this context that her talismans and charms are actually her songs. This is her magical ability to write these songs. And that's what she's presenting to us here, her talismans and charms. And she makes the comment in Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, where she talks about the lines of her songs containing narcotics, or magical spells, if you like. So I think talismans and charms is her songs. The fourth thing she brings into evidence is the tick, tick, tick of love bombs. And love bombing is one of the things that takes place, particularly in this short-term relationship, and that's really evident again in some of the songs. And the final thing that she brings to evidence, my veins of pitch black ink. I think it was Ernest Hemingway who said something like, and obviously I'm just paraphrasing from memory here, it's not difficult to write, he says, you just sit down at the typewriter and bleed onto the page. That's what she's doing here, my veins, the suggestion of blood, but her blood is filled with pitch black ink, and this bleeds onto the page, and that's what she presents to us as evidence. Then she closes it out with all's fair in love and poetry, obviously a play on the idea that all's fair in love and war. Interesting though that I think this kind of sees her as weaponizing her poetry, and she finishes it off sincerely, the chairman of the Tortured Poets Department. She's the chairman of the board. So there it is, In Summation by Taylor Swift. As always when I'm doing these things, this is not a cold reading. I've clearly read this poem several times and tried hard to understand it, but always as I'm going through I notice other things, which are actually quite a surprise to me as well. I'm sure that as you read this you have different interpretations of many parts of this. You may want to relate them more specifically to the lives of the individuals involved. I've pretty much avoided doing that. I've tried to focus not so much on the people in these relationships, not the men in these relationships, as the relationship itself, which I think is really what I want to focus on in the songs themselves too. And if you have very different ideas from me, please leave comments below. I love to hear what you have to say. So many times when I've been talking about a song, someone has pointed something out to me that I've completely missed or given a different interpretation, which I always think is really interesting. And I'm sure that could be the case here. As I'm presenting these interpretations, I often think of some things that T.S. Eliot said about his own poetry. Now, I can't remember the exact details or where he said it, but I think he was writing a letter to someone who was talking about interpreting one of his poems. And he was saying that even though he has his own thing in mind as he writes these poems, and sometimes he gets frustrated with the way other people interpret them, he acknowledges that once a poem is written, it's out there on the page, it's there for other people to interpret it. And they can bring new things to the poem that he didn't even have in mind at the time. A poem takes on a life of its own, if you like. And more technically, I think this is the process of hermeneutics. When you engage with a written text, you can never actually get the meaning itself directly from the text. You always kind of engage with the text and negotiate a meaning with the text. So that's why when we read a poem or a novel or hear a song, we come from it with our own interpretation because we come to it with our own framework and our own list of presuppositions. So we can't necessarily ever know exactly what's in the writer's mind. And that may not indeed be necessary because now these words have a life of their own and they're for us to interpret. And I'm reminded a little bit also of the manuscript, the last track on the anthology, where Taylor says the story isn't mine anymore. No, it's not. It's ours. And it's out there for us to read and interpret. So please join me in that process.